Joe Rogan is a man who really needs no introduction. A comedian, an actor, a reality TV show host, a UFC connoisseur, and one of the most popular and longest-lasting podcasters on the internet, Joe Rogan is the living embodiment of a cultural icon. And part of his appeal, at least as a podcaster, is the fact that he can be both relatable, yet sincere and straightforward. He gives the impression of being a good friend who you can hang out with, have a couple of beers with, and express your mind on the most random topics. Which is also quite literally how he organizes his podcasts. Like most people in the 20 to 30 age range, I've listened to my fair share of Joe Rogan podcasts in the past roughly half a decade. And as internet culture has evolved, this became almost an inevitability, since Joe Rogan has become such an integral part of internet culture that he is also a living meme. While I find some of his opinions interesting, and enjoy the way in which his podcast is structured, friendly, informal banter, in which Joe Rogan and his guest always seem to be talking about the least important and yet the most important stuff simultaneously, in which every profound philosophical point is automatically countered by some funny anecdote or the 10 millionth story of the time Joe Rogan went on a DMT trip or, hunted some antelope or something.
Put on some headphones and listen to a song that was created by the first wave of British superstars that came to America, and they're on acid, and they're singing about Lucy in the sky with diamonds, and it's amazing.
It is also important to keep in mind a particular point. While the internet's favorite bro is good at a lot of things, one thing that he seems to be terrible at is early church history. By now, everyone, at least everyone who studies theology, knows about this clip from 2015 in which Joe Rogan goes off on religion. Here, I'm going to focus on a particular excerpt in which he says something so blatantly wrong that I'm surprised some people still take it seriously.
You think someone walked on water? Do you believe in the literal translation? Are you an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy? Well, the New Testament. No, well, the New Testament was made by Constantine, who was a fucking Roman emperor who wasn't even Christian. He didn't even believe it. He became a Christian on his fucking deathbed. Like, that's when he became a Christian. Like, all these people that are, like, really into the New Testament. And, like, I'll talk about Old Testament and people get mad at me on Twitter. They'll send me this fucking hate text. You understand what the difference is between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Because the New Testament is utter whore. It's created by a bishop and a fucking emperor. That's a fact. That's, like, established religious fact. Like, everyone knows where it came from.
First, let us begin with Constantine, the favorite plaything of all religious-oriented conspiracy theorists. May I ask, Mr. Rogan, what evidence do you have that it was Constantine who ordered the creation of the New Testament? Like, what historical evidence is there? Any historical evidence. Literally anything. A single quote. A single decree. Even a second or third hand account. Anything? Ironically, what evidence I could find points towards the opposite conclusion. Joe Rogan is partially correct. Constantine wasn't baptized and therefore did not formally enter into the church until his deathbed. Yet for several decades prior to then, Constantine did things such as end the persecution of Christianity, study the Christian religion, make his sympathies towards Christianity publicly known through building Christian monuments, changing certain parts of the Roman legal system to get it more in line with Christian moral and social teaching, and funding various infrastructure projects that resulted in the construction of new churches, including St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Of course, all of this happened as a result of the following events. The Emperor Constantine, shortly before the Battle of Milvian Bridge, had a vision of the Chi-Rho symbol, which represented the name of Christ in Greek, and heard the voice of Christ say, "In this image you shall conquer." Constantine then ordered that the Chi-Rho symbol be painted on all of the shields of his soldiers, and be used as the banner under which they were to fight. As a result of this, Constantine and his forces won the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Now, some historians debate the authenticity of Constantine's conversion. Did he have a genuine mystical experience? Was he tolerating Christianity for political reasons or because of a sincere religious conversion? But what isn't up for debate is that whatever happened on Milvian Bridge set off a series of events that led to the end of the persecution of Christians by the Romans and eventually led Constantine to converting to Christianity. So Joe Rogan is staying true to history by saying that Constantine didn't join the church, at least not officially or formally, until relatively late in life. Where Joe Rogan completely misses the mark is when he says that Constantine was the one who commissioned the writing of the Bible, or at least the New Testament. And this can be shown when one looks at Book 1, Chapter 32 of the work The Life of Constantine, by the early Christian historian Eusebius, who was actually a contemporary of Constantine. Eusebius writes that shortly after his initial conversion, he wanted to learn more about the faith, and in describing his early spiritual formation, Eusebius goes on to write, and I quote, "Resolving to worship no other god save him who had appeared to him, he sent for those who were acquainted with the mysteries of his doctrines, and, persuaded that the knowledge of these things had been imparted to him by divine teaching, he determined thenceforth to devote himself to the reading of the inspired writings." Why this is important is because it shows that by the time of Constantine, that is, by about 300 years after Jesus, the texts of the Christian scripture, both Old and New Testaments, were already in existence and were already well read among early Christians. The Biography of Constantine, written by one of his contemporaries, a document that still has a lot of historical value for theologians, historians, and archaeologists today, states that Constantine, after learning the basic teachings of the Christian faith, wanted to more closely study the religious texts on which these teachings were based. This implies that the Christian religious leaders with whom Constantine was consulting were basing their teachings on already existing religious texts. So okay, Constantine didn't actually order the writing of the Bible. But what about Rogan's claim the New Testament was written by a bishop? Again, a bishop? Which bishop? Who? When? I mean, technically he's not incorrect. The bishops are the successors of the apostles, and the apostles had all of the authority of a bishop. So yes, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, Jude were all technically the first bishops of the church. But I don't think that's what Mr. Rogan meant. He was probably referring to some random churchman who lived several hundred years after Jesus, sometime around the life of Constantine. Now, there were some bishops who lived during or shortly after the time of Constantine who included in their writings lists of books that were included in the Bible. For example, St. Athanasius writing in the 4th century, or St. Augustine writing in the 5th century. Yet, these men were listing books that were already in use by the church at that time. The historical backdrop was that there were many other books written by early Christians that were considered for entry into the biblical canon, but were ultimately rejected, and thus there was a lot of debate concerning which books should be viewed as canonical and which ones should not. The notion that the biblical canon developed over time and wasn't officially codified until many centuries after the time of Jesus is not the same as saying that the books of the Bible themselves, at least the canonical books of the Bible, weren't written until many centuries after the time of Jesus. Those are two completely different claims. The fact of the matter is, we have found literally thousands of manuscripts, whether complete or near complete, or in fragments, containing the New Testament, going back to the earliest days of Christianity. Now, before we go further, we have to make a certain distinction. Biblical scholars create a few different categories of ancient biblical texts. Some were written on papyrus. Some early biblical manuscripts are known as unicles, or majuscules, which are basically texts written on parchment paper and which derive their name from the fact that they were written in all uppercase letters, as was the style in some ancient Greek and Roman texts. Some ancient biblical manuscripts are known as minuscules and derive their name from the fact that they are texts written in all lowercase letters, though minuscules, like unicles, tend to be written on parchment, usually in the form of book-like texts known as codices. Now, when you look at some early biblical manuscripts, some of them are dedicated to preserving a specific text in the Bible, but there were other early biblical texts that took the form of lectionaries. An lectionary is a collection of excerpts of biblical texts to be read during Christian religious services. Now, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and thus there was a special emphasis among New Testament scholars on the Greek translation tradition. When one looks at all of the earliest Greek New Testament manuscripts, more specifically papyri, unicles, minuscules, and lectionaries, one finds that between the 2nd and the 16th century, there were 5,197 New Testament texts. This includes 6 just from the period between the year 100 and 200, 30 from the 3rd century, and 2, the date of which is unknown, but which are believed to have been composed most likely either in the 2nd or in the 3rd centuries. There were 77 New Testament manuscripts written in the century in which Constantine lived, or within the 2 centuries prior to then. Now, these numbers I derived from a source originally published in the early 1980s, and which was revised several times since then. Since then, the numbers of ancient New Testament manuscripts has actually increased slightly. The most recent number I could find states that there are 5,856 Greek manuscripts. And that's just the Greek translations. You have, for example, the Peshitta. The Peshitta is a Syriac translation of the New Testament that dates back to the late 4th century or the early 5th century. The British scholar of early Syriac Christianity, Dr. Sebastian Brock, estimates that there are 60 manuscript copies of the Peshitta that scholars currently have possession of from between the 5th and 6th centuries, while the American biblical scholar Jeffrey Syker estimates that there are 350 manuscripts of the Peshitta just in general. So there are hundreds of manuscripts attesting to a specific translation tradition dating back to shortly after the time of Constantine. Yet there are older versions of the Syriac Bible. The oldest manuscript tradition within the Syriac language is the Diatessaron, written by the Assyrian Christian theologian Tatian in the late 2nd century, with the earliest examples of Syriac-speaking Christians citing this specific translation going back to the 4th century. Concerning the Latin translation, There was no unified Latin translation of the New Testament prior to St. Jerome's translation written in the 5th century. Yet, between the closing of the New Testament canon and the early 3rd century, there were no Latin translations of the Bible that we know of at all. The earliest Latin translation of the New Testament is believed to have been written in North Africa in the early or mid-3rd century. In fact, in the early church, there are 50 copies of what is called the Old Latin Bible, which is the collective name for any translation of the New Testament that predates Jerome's translation, known as the Vulgate, which means we're talking about roughly 50 texts that date back to before the 5th century. Overall, there are 10,000 copies of the Vulgate that we have, and there are over 2,000 copies of the New Testament from the early church written in Ethiopic, as well as over 2,500 copies of the New Testament from the early church written in Armenian. So, there are literally dozens, hundreds, and very often thousands of copies of the New Testament, depending on the manuscript tradition, dating back as early as within a century after Jesus. And when one attempts to date the individual New Testament texts themselves, so Mark's Gospel, Matthew's Gospel, the letters of St. Paul, most biblical scholars from across the ideological spectrum place the originals in a period spanning between the 50s AD and the year 100 AD. The earliest New Testament texts being the letters of St. Paul, which were written in the 50s and in the first half of the 60s AD, and the last book of the New Testament being the Gospel according to St. John, written sometime between 95 and 100. So the actual texts of the New Testament itself date back only a few decades after the time of Jesus. And the earliest copies of the New Testament that we have today date back to within a century after Jesus. And we know that the texts of the New Testament had to have been written by the end of the 1st century, since there were texts by early Christians, including the letter of St. Clement to the Corinthians, written in the 90s AD, the Didache, written sometime around the late 1st or early 2nd century AD, and the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch, written around the year 110 AD, which all quote, whether directly or indirectly, from the New Testament. So forget about Constantine. The New Testament was already completed and in circulation by the turn of the 2nd century. So we're talking 70 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And of all of the copies that have survived to this day, there are dozens, if not hundreds, that date back to the time of or prior to Constantine. None of this, in and of itself, demonstrates the historical authenticity of the New Testament or the Christian faith in general. But it does disprove the notion that the stories of Jesus' life, the compilations of his teachings, and the writings of his followers were just made up, pulled out of thin air, completely forged 300 plus years after the fact, and not by people who genuinely believed that Jesus was the Messiah who died and rose from the dead to save you from your sins, but by a political leader who wanted to increase ideological hegemony within his kingdom. The notion that the New Testament was written hundreds of years before Constantine even existed is, to use the words of Mr. Rogan,
that's a fact. That's like established religious fact.